The Amityville horror house has been named that for a reason. In the past, a person by the name of Ronald DeVeo Jr. shot and killed his entire family in that home. But this video in particular will be about the paranormal nature of this supposed haunted place. So let's begin. The tragedy in Amityville made grim local news, but few outside of New York ever heard about the house until sometime later. The horrendous events that followed began on December 18th, 1975, when a young couple named George and Kathy Lutz bought the house on Ocean Avenue for $80,000. Just a week before Christmas, they moved into their new dream home with Kathy's 3 children from a previous marriage. They would later claim that the dream home soon became a nightmare. Almost from the moment that they moved into the house, the Lutz family would insist they noticed an unearthly presence in the place. They began to hear mysterious noises that they could not account for. Locked windows and doors would inexplicably open and close, as if by invisible hands. George Lutz, a sturdy former Marine, claimed to be plagued by the sound of a phantom brass band that would march back and forth through the house. When a Catholic priest entered the house after agreeing to exorcise it, an eerie, disembodied voice told him to get out. After the aborted exorcism, the events began to intensify. The thumping and scratching sounds grew worse. A devilish creature was seen outside the windows at night. George Lutz was seemingly possessed by an evil spirit, and green slime even oozed from the walls and ceiling. The family was further terrified by ghostly apparitions of hooded figures, clouds of flies that appeared from nowhere, cold chills, personality changes, sickly odors, objects moving about on their own, the repeated disconnection of their telephone service, and communication between the youngest Lutz child and a devilish pig that she called Jody. Kathy Lutz reported that she was often beaten and scratched by unseen hands, and that one night she was literally levitated up off the bed. The family managed to hold out for 28 days before they gathered up their possessions and fled from the house. According to their story, they left so quickly that they didn't take their furniture or many of their other possessions with them. The demonic spirits, they said, had driven them from their home. And then things started to get really scary. In February 1976, not long after the Lutz family left the house, local residents were stunned to see New York Channel's 5 news team doing a live news feed from the house on Ocean Avenue. The news crew filmed a seance and a dramatic investigation of the place conducted by Ed and Lorraine Warren. For those not familiar with the Warrens, Lorraine claims to be a clairvoyant and a trance medium who is said to have the uncanny ability to contact the spirit world. On the other hand, her husband Ed purports to be an expert on hauntings and exorcism. From the 1950s through the 1980s, the Warrens, who are based in Connecticut, were recognized as authorities when it came to ghosts and demons. While they were still active until recent years, their methods have been replaced by more scientific standards of investigation. Regardless, in 1976, their stamp of approval on the events reported at Amityville caught the attention of a nation. The Warrens went to the house for the first time in February, and while George Lutz allegedly refused to accompany them, he did loan them a key. The Warrens stated that they found old newspapers around the house, and that the refrigerator was still stocked with food. It was obvious to them, they said, that the Lutz family had left in a hurry. The Warrens brought 2 other psychics with them to the house to conduct their seance. They later reported that they sensed an unearthly presence in the house, and Ed Warren also claimed to experience heart palpitations that he blamed on the occult forces. The house was haunted, they said, by the angry spirits of Indians who had once inhabited the area and by inhuman spirits. The story was that the Indians had used that very parcel of land as a place where sick and insane members of the tribe were isolated until they died. They did not bury the dead there, however, because they supposedly believed the land was infested with demons. Not long after, the George and Kathy Lutz teamed up with a writer named Jay Anson, and together they authored what would become the best-selling book called The Amityville Horror. The book would then go on to spawn a bad movie and a number of even worse sequels, and not surprisingly, the Warrens were hired by producer Dino De Laurentiis and the production company to serve as consultants about the supernatural occurrences portrayed in the film. They also made the rounds of the talk show circuit, discussing the horrifying events in Amityville. The Amityville Horror grew from news reports and newspaper articles to books, magazines and television. The story would become internationally known and around the world. People recognized the name of Amityville. Most amazing was the fact that this terrifying story was absolutely true, or so it read in bold print on the cover of the phenomenally selling book. But not everyone was convinced, even in paranormal circles. In fact, a few of them smelled something bad in Amityville. One of those was a paranormal investigator from New York named Dr. Stephen Kaplan. George Lutz had approached him on February 16, 1976, about conducting an investigation of the house on Ocean Avenue. This was shortly before Lutz turned to the Warrens instead. At that time, Kaplan was the executive director of the Parapsychology Institute of America, based on Long Island, and he was frequent guest on the popular WBAB radio program Spectrum with Joel Martin. He received a phone call from Lutz and wanted the society to investigate the house for supernatural activity. He asked about a fee for the group's service, and Kaplan told him that they did not charge for the investigation, but that, if the story is a hoax, the public will know. A few days later, Lutz called and cancelled the investigation. He claimed that he and his wife did not want any publicity about the house. This may have been why the Channel 5 news story came as such a surprise to Kaplan and his colleagues a few days later. Kaplan would later claim to have been suspicious of the call and the Lutz's motives from the very beginning. When he began asking questions, he asked what specifically had happened to the family in the house. Lutz said that he was unable to describe the phenomena, but that there were demons in the house that he knew by name. When asked to name them, Lutz refused, claiming that they would appear if he mentioned their name aloud. Kaplan asked who told him that, and Lutz said that he had read it in a book. He could not remember the title, he said, but it had been one of many about demonology, ghosts, and psychic phenomena that he had read since buying the house on Ocean Avenue. As the story of the Amityville Horror became an international sensation, Kaplan was at work collecting evidence and materials about the house and the claims made by the Lutz family, Jay Olsen, the Warrens and the media. Although convinced of the validity of the paranormal and supernatural activity, Kaplan was not convinced of the truth behind the Amityville case. While it was possible that a haunting could have occurred at the house, especially in light of the violent events that had taken place there was something not quite right about the accounts of the Lutz's family. After some initial investigation, Kaplan became sure that a hoax was being perpetrated on the public, and such a hoax could prove to be damaging for legitimate paranormal cases in the future. With that in mind, he became determined to show that the entire story was a farce. Little did he know that he would face an uphill battle, not only against the Warrens, but against the general public as well. By this time, the Warrens had become too firmly entrenched to back out of the case. They continued to resolutely support the Lutz's claims of the house being haunted or possessed by evil forces. They began their own campaign to try and discredit Stephen Kaplan, especially after his untimely death a number of years later. To this day, in spite of confessions, and in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary, the Warrens still maintained that the house was haunted. The general public had been so force-fed the story by the media that Kaplan's evidence against the house being haunted seemed to fall on deaf ears. Thanks to the fact that the truth was not as glamorous or as dramatic as the original story, the news story was scarcely reported and was barely noticed at first. In fact, Kaplan's diaries of the investigations were turned into a book that did not get published for many years after the events took place. The problem remained that the public loved the story, and the house on Ocean Avenue became a Long Island landmark. People traveled from all over the country to drive past and stare at it. Tourists made it their first stop on Long Island, and locals soon began calling the sightseers the Amityville Horribles. The trouble with curiosity seekers and complaints from locals were so bad in the late 1970s that they drove one Amityville police chief into early retirement. Kaplan had discovered that the Amityville Horror was pure invention. In 1979, attorney William Weber confessed to his part in the hoax during a paranormal radio show hosted by author Joel Martin. Weber admitted that he and George Lutz had concocted the story of the haunting over a few bottles of wine. Weber's motive was to get a new trial for DeVeo, using a devil-made-him-do-it defense. According to Weber, Lutz merely wanted to get out from under a mortgage that he couldn't afford. His business was in trouble and he needed a scheme to bail him out. Weber later filed a $2 million lawsuit against the Lutz's family, charging them with reneging on their book deal. Now this article even goes on more and more about these supposed claims of this being a hoax, and I found that was interesting because for a lot of people this story is real. When I was younger I thought it was real as well. Even to this day I still like to think that it is real, but at the same time this is also really interesting concerning this case, knowing that there was someone else out there that wasn't really in the media or portrayed in the media having evidence that it is actually a hoax, and then having someone who was in on it admitting it on radio that they actually concocted the entire story. That's pretty sad. I don't know if that's true though, because I don't know if that interview is actually online or anything, because it's been many years ago. If it is online, well, maybe we can hear it for ourselves sometime. Otherwise, we just have to take this with a grain of salt as well, because, you know, maybe someone made this up in order to make this case look like a hoax. That's also something you always have to take into account with situations like these. And if you found this story interesting, please hit the like button below. And as always, dear viewer, have sweet dreams.